They like what I've done for Israel, I can tell you that. We have a lot of rabbis. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm in trouble, but let's get on with it. Do you mind? Let's get on. Because with your help, we're going to make America great again. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Donald Trump is going to explain a little bit of what evangelicals call their testimony. He's going to reminisce on growing up in two churches, the first a Presbyterian, and the second, it seems it was non-denominational. The main theme is God's providence. God has guided him through life and has ordained all the events of his life that have led him to the present. Let's watch what he has to say, and then the second clip will be Bishop Barron explaining a Catholic understanding of divine providence. This is very fascinating. Check this out.
So I was introduced to church at a very early age, and I had a wonderful church actually in Jamaica, Queens, First Presbyterian Church. I don't know if you know it. It was built a long time ago, and it was great. But very early, and then ultimately on Sundays, my parents, Fred and Mary, would drive me into Manhattan to worship at Marble Collegiate Church, where Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, the author of one of the really big bestsellers, The Power of Positive Thinking, he was the head pastor. Great book. It was a great book then and a great book now. Power of Positive Thinking. A lot of people could use a little positive thinking, right? And he was an incredible speaker. My sister and I were both married there, and the funeral services for both of my parents, I mean, my mom and dad they took place in the main sanctuary of Marble Collegiate Church, and it was just always very special. I still remember the great sermons of Norman Vincent Peale, and he truly was one of the greatest speakers I've ever. First, he was a believer, but he was also a great speaker, an unbelievable man. I actually saw his last sermon, but when you left church, you were really disappointed that it was over. I mean, I have to say, we have a lot of pastors and ministers, but sometimes it's like, am I allowed to say that? It's like a Biden, you know? Sometimes. Not often, of course. But this man, and you know, he always preached in sort of modern times, a little bit in modern times. He'd bring it up. I remember so many of his sermons, but he talked about Alfred Sloan, who was the founder of General Motors, and how he grew up and how he had tremendous problems with alcohol, and he became a major alcoholic. And then, you know, Norman Vincent Peale would just say, and then one day he met God, and he was just the expression of this man. He used to stand at a podium, and he'd be like this, just like that, and he'd preach, and you really were, you know, you were disappointed when it was over. He'd tell you stories about God, about many things, about life. It was really stories about life and how it pertained to religion, and it was really amazing, and he was amazing. And a brilliant, just the enthusiasm he had. And I listened to him for, I would say, 20 years. And then one day, I went to church, Marble Collegiate, and he was now, I guess, in his 90s. And he was preaching, and you could see he was getting a little bit tired. And he stood, just like I said, right over here to the left of the podium. And he said, I can't do this anymore. That was it. And he just sat down. We all understood. He was just, it was really, it was his last time at the podium, and the last time he preached. And it was an amazing moment, and everybody just stood up and applauded. It was sort of a beautiful thing to watch, actually. But to see him, because he was truly a very big name at the time and very respected. And the fact that he wrote this book that was such a big bestseller, it was a massive bestseller, still is, I think. But as I look back at my life's journey and events, I now recognize that it's been the hand of God leading me to where I am today.
Stephen Colbert gave an interview to GQ magazine in which his Catholic faith was on pretty clear display. He was talking about a terrible trauma he experienced as a young man. When he was only 10, his father and two of his brothers died in a plane accident. He talked about how, through the ministration of his mother, he was able not only to accept what had happened, but even to rejoice in it, to benefit from it. And let me quote something from the interview, which is really something. "Boy, did I have a bomb when I was 10. That was quite an explosion." And then he says this, "It's that I love the thing that I wish most had not happened." I love the thing I wish most had not happened. Well, the interviewer was obviously sort of flummoxed when he said that, and he asked him to elaborate upon it. And without missing a beat, Colbert cited the great J.R.R. Tolkien, who said, "Are not all of God's punishments also gifts?" And then he repeated it. And in the interview it said his eyes fill with tears. Are not all of God's punishments also gifts? Now, here's what struck me when I read that. Tolkien. The Tolkien quote, by the way, is not from The Hobbit, not from The Lord of the Rings. It's from a rather obscure letter that Tolkien wrote in response to an inquirer who had said, "I wonder whether you take death with sufficient seriousness in your writing." And so Tolkien responded, and in that response is that line, "Are not all of God's punishments also gifts?" Well, I began to muse on this, thinking of Tolkien. Where would Tolkien have learned that lesson? Well, like Stephen Colbert, Tolkien experienced a lot of trauma as a young man. His parents had moved to South Africa, and they had these two little boys. And then the father dies when Tolkien was just a little kid. His mother, Mabel, brings the boys back to England. So upon their return to England, Mabel Tolkien takes the remarkable decision to become a Roman Catholic. And we say, well, what's the big deal? You have this little minor conversion, but in those days it meant an enormous big deal because she was repudiated by her family. She was ostracized by much of English society. In fact, her family basically disowned her, and she went into real poverty. Well, during that time, this terrible period, she turned to the priests of the Birmingham Oratory and reached out to them for support, both spiritual and financial. Well, in 1904, when she was only 34, Mabel Tolkien died of diabetes. So here she has these two sons now who are orphans. Well, they were taken in by a deeply sympathetic priest of the Birmingham Oratory, whose name was Francis Xavier Morgan. And Father Francis took them in, educated them, and really taught them the lessons of life. So later on, Tolkien, who always referred to him very affectionately as Father Francis, said he really taught us the ways of compassion and forgiveness. He became a father figure to him. In fact, many people speculate that a lot of the wisdom figures, especially Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, have a lot of Father Morgan in them. So here's the further question as I mused on all this. So where did Father Morgan learn his spiritual lessons, which he undoubtedly conveyed to the young Tolkien? Because how did the young Tolkien get through all this? How did he learn that all of God's punishments are also gifts? Undoubtedly from Father Morgan. Where did Father Morgan learn it? Well, as I say, he's a priest of the Birmingham Oratory, which had been founded in the mid-19th century by the great John Henry Newman. Newman had just become a Catholic with all of the attendant problems. So Newman was a leader in English society. Becoming a Catholic, he was kicked out of Oxford, he was kicked out of polite society, he could hold no official position. His life was radically compromised. During this period, when the Anglican establishment turns on him, and the Catholics were kind of wary of him. They thought, well, here's this converted, Protestant minister. Newman was going through a real Lent, as he put it. He felt, he said, like Sisyphus at this time. It was a real crisis. During that period, he founds this oratory in industrial Birmingham. And then it eventually grows into being a very important center of Catholic evangelism. Newman, of course, in time becomes again a major figure in English society, but he endured a tremendous suffering during this period. He would have conveyed to his Oratorian brothers and disciples a lesson, it seems to me, that all of God's punishments are also gifts. So, as we keep musing, no Newman, no Birmingham Oratory. No Birmingham Oratory, no Father Morgan. No Father Morgan, no Tolkien learning this important spiritual lesson. Imagine how this orphan child, without the guidance of this figure, probably would have drifted into unbelief or into secularism. So no Father Morgan, no Tolkien with his great spiritual insight. No Tolkien with his great spiritual insight, no Stephen Colbert, able to endure his childhood trauma. And here, I come to the point, really, of this whole discourse, which is the mysterious workings of God's providence. How easy it is for us to say, life is just one thing after another, just a series of unrelated events. How easy to say, suffering is just dumb pain, it's just dumb trouble that we endure. But see, people with the eyes of faith see the outworking of God's great plan. Why are we given suffering? Why are we given trauma? Well, see, it might be for the sake of someone who's not even born yet. It might be, as Paul says, that we might receive in our sufferings a consolation we can communicate to somebody else. But that somebody else might be someone not even born yet. Did John Henry Newman ever dream, when he was establishing the Birmingham Oratory, of J.R.R. Tolkien? Did he ever dream of the great spiritual lessons of the Lord of the Rings? Did he ever dream that an American comedian in the early 21st century would be so influenced by this that his life would be revolutionized? St. John Paul II said that for people of faith, there are no coincidences, only aspects of God's providence not fully understood. That's a line that will take your breath away. A line, if you think about it, will change your whole life. There are no coincidences. Bob Dylan said that we're hanging in the balance of a perfect finished plan, like every sparrow fallen, like every grain of sand. We're in the balance of a perfect finished plan, but we don't see it. But see, with the eyes of faith, we do see it. It's the outworking of God's providence. And that's what I take from this rather remarkable interview with Stephen Colbert, that he might be ingredient in this wonderful outworking of God's providential design.